So yeah, I'm just gonna take you through the agenda, and then we're gonna hear from our friend and team member, Matt Ewers from IEDS Logistics. And then we're gonna kind of talk about this freight study and how it fits into sort of the big picture for the region. And then we're going to take a look at the data and some of the maps and visualizations that we've been able to produce here. And we'll have a discussion about that. If you looked at the original agenda, we had small breakout rooms. We're just going to keep it a larger group discussion. So please feel free to speak up. If you guys have questions, we'll give you time after sort of each little section here for question and answer. If something's really pressing, you can use the little hand icon at the bottom of your screen. So we'll get going here. And so you can hopefully see the agenda. So yeah, we'll conclude about 12 o'clock, maybe a little sooner. So let's go to the next slide. So Matt doesn't have a presentation. He's going to just share with us. And I thought I would give a little bio since I didn't do that properly for the last two of our guest presenters. So Matt is the principal and senior vice president of IEDS Logistics here in Spokane. And IEDS stands for Inland Empire Distribution System. So Matt's a board trustee with Spokane Area Good Roads, FMSIB, SRTC, Washington Trucking Association, and a returning board member to GSI. So he has a mechanical engineering degree from WSU, an MBA from Brno University, and a master's in finance from GU, so very well-rounded. And he spent the first 20 years of his career providing engineering design services for carrier corporations and with Dole Food Company. So about 18 years ago, Matt returned to Spokane to join his family logistics business. So keeping it in the family. So thanks, Matt, for sharing a little bit about IEDS, and I'll pass the baton to you.
All right, sound check. Can you hear me okay?
If you can turn the volume up a little bit or speak into it a little bit more, that might be helpful.
Does this help at all? A little bit better?
A little bit. Yeah.
I don't know how to turn up volume on this thing. I'll just speak louder because I don't know how to turn the volume up on my phone.
Okay.
I didn't know there's even a volume on here. I'm working out of my office with a phone, and that's how I'm communicating. I do have you guys I have the computer up. I just don't have a camera on at work for security reasons. So, thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of share what we do in the Pacific Northwest. Kind of similar to what Jeff does. We have a little bit of a different twist to it. But so we operate a freight activity center. One of the questions was, what's the relationship with land use and freight activity centers in Spokane County? We operate a freight activity center with multiple modes of transportation. So we work with parcel carriers, LTL carriers like Jeff Bosma, truckload and rail freight. We're in Spokane, we're in the industrial park, and that is the largest freight activity center between Seattle and Minneapolis by tonnage. We also are we operate a facility where long-haul carriers come from other parts of the United States or Canada, come in, they unload, we reload them and send them back out. So, and we also operate with both Class 1 railroads. We're the premier transloader in the Spokane Coeur d'Alene area, also Tri-Cities, for unloading or reloading rail cars, and we provide the first and last mile with our own trucks. Our core business is vendor-managed inventory for manufacturing companies in the Spokane Coeur d'Alene area. What we do is we basically are going to bring in the raw materials to our facility and just in time to the manufacturing facility. And this allows the manufacturers to focus on their core business and not manage, without having to manage their vendors.
Sorry about that, Matt. Go ahead.
We also transport freight from the ports of Seattle, Tacoma, into Spokane or Pasco, and we also operate a transfer station in Moses Lake. Because with our limited hours of service, we can't. It's very difficult, almost impossible, to run a truck from Spokane into the port of Seattle, get loaded, and get back to Spokane. You run out of hours. So we use a transfer station in Moses Lake. So another question was, can you have day-to-day challenges with existing roadway infrastructure or freight logistics? One of the biggest issues is I-90 freeway parking, not just I-90, but freeway parking for commercial trucks. If you're coming in, and it's not just my company, this is all companies. You're hauling freight into Seattle by truck, and you're coming in at 2:00 in the morning. You don't have an appointment till 9. You got to park your truck somewhere. You're not going to time your appointment exactly when you arrive in the city. So it's a big problem. We've presented this through WTA and SRTC. We've talked about this, trying to get DOT on board with putting together some parking areas. Premature bridge closures, what they do is in some cases, they allow commercial or vehicles, but not commercial freight. That increases route time and cost. Another thing that is an issue is road diet, especially in areas where we've got to deliver freight, because what that means is the road is narrowed, and then they put a bike path right adjacent this road, and our mirrors stick out in some cases, beyond the actual width of the road. If the road diet becomes 9 feet, our mirrors are 10.5 feet, so they're sticking beyond. So if you're riding a bike in there, you can get smacked in the head. The other thing, I really see this a lot, especially in areas where we're delivering, is bike lanes. They're separated from freight quarters with a simple painted line. And you're a driver, you're a professional driver trying to stay in your lane, and you got little kids riding bikes trying to stay in their painted white line. That doesn't work very well. I've always stated that, and I'm a biker myself, but bike paths and freight quarters don't mix at all. Intersection stoplights versus roundabouts. And I get this a lot from our drivers. The roundabouts, they do reduce smog, they reduce accidents, they reduce fuel consumption, and they reduce the amount of maintenance with respect to brake wear. They're great in that respect. So it's saying it a different way. So they're more environmentally friendly, improve safety, but they also, there's some, and I'm going to explain a little bit later, we do need some community training on roundabouts, not just for truckers, but for other vehicles. Another challenge is, of course, everybody knows this, the economic shutdown by our governor due to COVID-19. What we're seeing is a lot of there's increased anxiety by the other drivers. It seemed to have less patience, not willing to follow the rules of the road. We see rapid lane changes, accelerated spurts, hard braking. Those are challenges we're dealing with today. A third thing that was brought up is how is IEDS either impact or impacts the freight network. Well, we are a major component in the supply chain for goods within the aerospace, construction, consumer, chemical, and industrial products. That's our warehousing facilities. IEDS is a 3PL. We're third-party logistics. We have over 1 million square feet in our network, and we're providing local and regional distribution services with our own fleet and with our freight management services in the Pacific Northwest. We offer warehouse fulfillment. That's that e-commerce that everybody's dealing with. But we do not operate the trucks for parcel delivery. We're full truckload. So we're also the premier truckload transloader for the BNSF and the Union Pacific Railroad. I mentioned that earlier in Spokane and Tri-Cities. And IEDS is responsible for, and Jeff knows this, we work with Jeff's company. We're responsible for all USDA food delivery to the schools in Washington State. And some other impacts with IEDS in the area is just to let you know, Spokane is not self-sufficient, so all food, clothing, appliances, electronics, autos, and all medical supplies are all imported into our city. So therefore, you need a good freight network to bring all these items into our city. And our largest export is garbage, which also requires either rail or truck freight to handle that. So in a sense, Spokane is heavily reliant on freight logistics to maintain our standard of living. The fourth thing I was asked to talk about is specifics regarding surface transportation trips, data and anecdotal experience. We're mainly a truckload carrier, but we use a lot of other carriers in the area and outside the area to handle a lot of the freight that comes in and out of our place. We're basically 30, 40 trips a day. Um, you mentioned crash and vehicle damage due to road infrastructure. I can't say there's any that we can point to at this time. We do have traffic issues, like Barker Road is shut down for maintenance. That does cause some issues. I-95 delays in the afternoon. That light system to enter I-90 creates some issues. So, but it seems to be working pretty good on I-90, 195 right now. We do a lot of loads out of Lewiston. Again, I've talked about traffic circles are challenging. What we need with the longer trailers, we need to take up both lanes, and buses are doing the same thing. So it's not just ours. Long vehicles are going to take up both lanes in a traffic circle. We get that, but it's dealing with the community that isn't aware of that, and trying to navigate these trucks through a roundabout during rush hour just exacerbates the challenge. There might be some need to do some community awareness with regard to buses and trucks passing through a roundabout. How does Spokane compare to other regions and counties? We're much better in Seattle and Portland. We have our I-90 viaduct is really efficient, running east and west, and the new North Spokane corridor is going to provide great efficiency going for our north-south. So I think Spokane's in pretty good shape. I'm glad we have a committee like this to continue improving the situation, because that's just going to make us more competitive globally. So that's all I got to say. Am I on time? Hello? Hello?
Sorry, Matt. Yes, you are just perfectly on time. Thank you for sharing.
Scared me for a little bit. I thought I was talking to myself for the last 5
I got
10
lost.
minutes.
My mouse got lost. Like, what's doing? Does anybody have any questions for Matt specifically? Seeing none here, I just want to thank Matt. Thank you for sharing. Oh, it looks like maybe Shar has a question. I'm going to pass it to Shar. Go ahead, Shar. And
hello, Matt. This is Shar. I was just curious,
Hi,
if it's not proprietary information, what type of commodity are you carrying through 195 from Lewiston? Is it agricultural or other?
No, it's not agriculture. It's more paper goods.
Okay.
So it's in dry van
Mm-hmm.
and containers and things like that. So agriculture is probably more likely on bulk, hopper trucks or something like that, or hopper rail cars. But no, it's paper products out of Lewiston.
Awesome.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Matt, for sharing, your sort of challenges and how you guys, how you're impacted and how you impact the transportation network here regionally. We appreciate that little insight, and we.
And one other thing, Jeff has anything to add? I mean, he's operating a bigger fleet of trucks than we are, and he does both LTL and truckload, where my company's only truckload. So maybe if he has any challenges I didn't mention.
Yeah, and then we have a question from Todd as well. So go ahead, Jeff.
Okay.
Looks like you're still muted, Jeff. Let me see if I can. Oh, there we
I
go.
would just add to that, the entry point from 195 on to I-90 is probably the biggest bottleneck in the Inland Empire right now for us. And that happens from 2 p.m. on through the end of the day. Basically, it cleans up, obviously later in the evening about 6:30, 7 o'clock. But that's probably, for us, we are coming up there with maybe 10 trucks in a day. And that would be agricultural products and manufactured products coming through there. But yeah, otherwise I'm pretty spot on with what Matt was saying there on everything else. It is nice to see a group like this working on these issues here.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that. How about Todd?
Matt, this is Todd Coleman, S3R3. Hey, I got a question for you. So you mentioned the need to have a facility in Moses Lake in order. I think the reason was because basically your drivers time out unless you go to a team. I've heard many times that some areas in Spokane actually you can reach the seaports and do a turn without having a team of drivers. Can you maybe shed some light on that issue? Because I mean, it definitely has, I think, an impact on our increase in truck traffic here in the future, and whether or not you brought up the need for places to stay, park trucks and things along the freeway, along those stops and routes.
Sure, I'd love to. In a perfect world, you could drive over there with no congestion, and you're going to go into the port and get loaded immediately and back out again. That doesn't exist. Okay, first of all, you're going to go into the port. We're running, in some cases, 40 to 100 trucks a month in and out of that port, and never are you able to get into that port and get out of there within an hour. It just doesn't work that way. Especially they were shut down on Friday, so it's just they're always congested there. And then just trying to get into the port, due with the congestion there in Seattle, Tacoma's not bad, and then you've got getting over the pass in the wintertime, this and that. I mean, you're going slow. You're not going to drive an average of 60 miles an hour with a truck. It's just not realistic. Your average is more like 45 to 50 till you get to Seattle, and then it drops way down. So you got 11 hours. You're not going to make it. So we transfer so we can get a truck at Moses Lake to turn. Try to get 2 loads a day if we can, and then into Spokane we definitely can get 2 out of Moses Lake. That's our experience. I don't know how you can get from Spokane to Port of Seattle. Definitely not Port of Tacoma, because that's another half-hour drive. But Port of Seattle and back in the same day with 11 hours of driving, I don't know how you do it.
Well, thank you, Matt. Todd, does that answer your question? Yeah. Awesome. I got a thumbs up, Matt. Thanks again, Matt. We appreciate your time, and we'll be reaching out to more of you to share prior to these SME meetings. So I'm going to pass the baton over to Mike, part of our Freight SME team lead, and he is going to share sort of like a big picture. How does this freight study fit into sort of our regional look? So go ahead.
Thanks, Kylie. Kylie, can you just confirm that you can see me and hear me?
I can hear you and see you, and I'm going to advance the slide for you.
Great, thanks. So I thought I would talk for just a few minutes and try to sort of bridge the gap between some of the issues that Matt has described in his presentation, being a supply chain provider or purveyor, and some of the long-range planning efforts that we're doing. As I've mentioned in earlier meetings, this effort, this freight plan study and investment strategy, is all part of the will become part of the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. And so we've heard from the public development authorities. We've now heard from a private logistics company. And so I thought I would take us back up to that 30,000 foot level and talk about where all this is fitting in, where these good dialogues, these great discussions are fitting into the larger planning effort. So I've bulleted out kind of three things that I want to talk about here. As I mentioned, where does freight fit into our current long range planning? What questions do we want to answer with data? And David's going to expound on that during his part of the presentation. But I did want to talk about the connection between data and what we're doing on the planning side and why. And then we'll talk a little bit more about what questions we have answered with the data. And David's going to provide some of those details in his portion of the presentation. So where does freight fit in long-range planning? First and probably most obvious, but I did want to restate it here, is that part of the reason that we're going through this analysis effort is to establish base conditions so that we can further explore forecasted freight-related impacts. We've heard about the freight-related impacts currently from, again, the Public Development Authority, now from Matt. And I think we're hearing a sort of at least in broad strokes, that the freight network operates well. You know, there might be varying degrees of that depending on what time of the day we're talking about, but just generally, I think we have a well-functioning freight network. What we don't want to lose sight of is how that freight network will function in the future, and that's sort of why we're planning around freight, why we're developing a 20-year plan, so that we can look forward and understand, as we grow as a region, how are those impacts going to be realized on the freight network. And so that's probably most obviously why we need to establish the base conditions so that we can compare them to the forecasted conditions. The second bullet I have here is the inclusion of freight in measuring system performance. There are a variety of measures commonly used to measure the performance of the vehicular network. Some of those apply to freight movements like pavement condition. Matt mentioned that today in his presentation, but some might not, and they might be specific to freight, like, for example, resiliency or the network's ability to recover from a disruption. So if there's an accident on I-90, that accident is going to have broader impacts to freight movements than it likely would to vehicular movements, because there's sort of less on the line, right? So those freight specific performance measures we need to begin to establish and develop and track and use to evaluate our freight related investments. The third bullet I have there is increased coordination with air and rail partners. We're just really scratching the surface with this study. We're really laying a foundation for freight planning into the future and to subsequent MTPs, Metropolitan Transportation Plans. And frankly, we have limited data on rail volumes and air cargo volumes. So there's still work to do to understand those impacts on the regional network and their future impacts on the regional network. So we'd like to build those relationships with our partners at Spokane airports, as well as our Class 1 railroads, and begin to incorporate that data and develop a more full picture of freight in the region. The fourth thing I have here is not going to be anything new to our private sector folks. In fact, this is what they're dealing with daily to understand their businesses. But for those that are not in the private sector and haven't studied these things closely, there is a relationship that exists between efficient transportation infrastructure investment, leading to increased productivity, leading to increased competitiveness, leading to increased economic growth. So if we all just sort of subscribe to this idea that as a region we want to increase economic growth, and we back that relationship up to efficient transportation infrastructure investments, we need to realize those. We need to be as efficient as possible with our transportation infrastructure investments, and that needs to include freight. And so that's another sort of overarching reason why we're drilling down into freight specifically as part of this MTP update. The last thing I have on there is the region's growth relationship with future demand of freight and goods. And I sort of talked about that with number one. And again, no surprise to our private sector folks, but recent innovations in logistics and supply chains, such as containerization, just-in-time deliveries, and e-commerce, all the things Matt talked about, those are revolutionizing and altering global shipping patterns, as our private sector folks know. But what we need to do is understand how those innovations are going to impact freight movements into the future, so that we're not investing in the same way that we've been investing for the last 100 years. Because if the supply chain is innovating, then as we need to also be innovating commensurately with our transportation investments so that they are as effective as possible so that we can realize that maximum increased economic growth. That was a lot, but I did want to just try to bring us back to why we are planning for freight in our long-range plan and how we're trying to bridge that gap between private sector need and public investment. So we've mentioned in previous meetings that we've acquired this ATRI data, and I'm not going to steal any of David's thunder here. He's going to talk about what we did with that ATRI data and how it helps inform some of our planning efforts. But I did want to talk about some of the questions we wanted to answer with the data because these do have the sort of planning implications. I've already talked enough about the base conditions of the current network and why that's important. But these other two bullets I do want to highlight here. Are there opportunities to improve productivity by allowing for improvements in logistics? And this is using the data to understand how commodities are flowing, where there are bottlenecks, where there are a high frequency of origins and destinations of freight-related trips. All of these help us understand that network in a data-driven way. I think if we all sort of thought about the freight network, we'd have this idea of what that network is and how it functions, and everybody might have a little varying degree of description of what that is or a little different idea about what that means. What the data allows us to do is really just look at a quantitative approach to what that network is so that we can zero in on some of these productivity improvements that might be possible with freight-related transportation infrastructure. And then the third bullet here is always probably the most popular when we talk about money and grants and investing in freight-related infrastructure. We need to be able to prioritize those investments. And so this data allows us to understand where there's the most need, whether that be safety or mobility or whatever category you're looking at. We're able to use the data to understand which investments may be the most effective in a quantitative way. And so why are we asking all these questions? Well, I've sort of talked about that first bullet there. The most sort of regulatory answer is we have to, because we're required by the federal government to measure performance in terms of truck travel time reliability. Right now, we rely on the state to set some of those targets, and we support those targets. But as these regulations evolve, it's entirely likely that will be required, and I would argue it's probably best practice that the regions start developing some of their own performance measures. And so this data is going to help us do that, understand where we're at currently and where we want to be as a system. The third bullet there, it helps provide regional context to the federally required state plan. I would imagine most of you know that the state Department of Transportation has a freight plan. And us studying this regionally allows us the opportunity to help inform that state plan in a more specific way. So the state doesn't have to necessarily make assumptions about what's going on in the Spokane region. They can use our outputs from our study directly into their study, and it's a more, I'd say it's a more accurate or comprehensive look at the region as a whole instead of the state sort of developing those plans, not necessarily in a vacuum, but this allows them the opportunity to understand Spokane in a more specific way. And then the last thing I have there is a performance-based investment. This is the idea that we're investing in the system based on the performance of the system, and we can do that with data. We can understand that performance using the data that we've acquired, and if we continue to monitor that performance, we can guide those investments where the need is the greatest. And so that's obviously very important when you consider that transportation revenues are declining, especially in the this sort of post-COVID or I guess COVID era. Those revenues are declining, and that's becoming more and more important. So I've mentioned data quite a bit. ATRI data is the main tool we're using in this study to answer the questions that I've talked about. So with that, I'll turn it over to David to discuss what we've done in partnership with Eastern Washington University with the ATRI data.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And yeah, so what I'm going to do is basically pick up where we left off in the previous SME team meeting and show you how we've used the ATRI data and some other sources as well to incorporate the feedback that we received from from this team. So next slide, please. So just a quick refresher on that data, which we talked about in the first meeting. So it's from 2019, so it's very recent. And we did a pretty comprehensive review of all the potential freight data trip sources out there and found that it was the most complete by a pretty significant margin. So we acquired, like I said, 2019 data. It's broken up into 4 different time slices to capture the seasonality and the variations there that exist in freight trips, and so it's, like I said, pretty comprehensive. It's pretty raw data when we receive it. It's just GPS pings, which you can see on the map there on the right. It's got a timestamp associated with each ping, a unique vehicle ID, which is really critical, and then latitude and longitude coordinates. Next slide. So as Mike said, we partnered with Eastern Washington's geography department to get this data processed into something that was usable for our purposes here, to evaluate our freight network, look at activity centers, look at trip origins and destinations and what routes they're taking to get where. So there's really 3 individual steps that Eastern took in processing this data, and I don't want to get too into the weeds here, so I'll just go over these really quickly. But first, they split the data into trips. So like I said, it's just a bunch of GPS pings with a unique vehicle ID and time, and using time and distance thresholds, they were able to break it out into trips. Additionally, though, we wanted them to snap it to our transportation network. You can see in the map there on the top right side of your screen, that is kind of a zoomed in look at the data. So you can see all those GPS pings, and the blue lines there are transportation networks. So this is an intersection here, or an interchange here in the region. And you can see that they follow the road center lines, but they aren't directly on those. So that limits our ability to look at volumes and estimate those on the actual road network. So they snapped those trips to the road network. And then the last piece was kind of identifying outliers. In any major or really large big data set like this, there's going to be data that's not really usable, data that if you include in your analysis is going to throw them off, kind of outliers, things like that. One particular example of this is just when you look at the county boundary, because the trip, as far as our pings are concerned, ends at the county boundary. So you see those as real origin destination hotspots in the raw data, but they were able to identify those trips so that we can, if we want to, exclude those from the data set when we're trying to just identify origins and destinations, but we can also include them if we want to look at stuff like external trips versus internal trips. So they made the data more flexible for us and processed it in a way where it's a usable format. So I'll show you some of the initial analyses we've done, like I said, based on your feedback in the previous meeting to start looking at these freight activity centers. And after this, what we're going to do is start looking at the transportation network, which we'll plan on showing you in the next team meeting, so we can kind of connect the network to the activity centers. But just starting out, here you can see from that ATRI data set, the origins and destinations in the process data. So you can see those activity centers really start to pop out, like the Spokane Valley industrial area. You can see East Spokane. You can see the truck stop on I-90 near Geiger really show up, and some stuff in North and Northeast Spokane as well. So we started looking at this to begin to identify those hotspots and define our freight activity centers. But in addition to that, we looked at a few different criteria that you had mentioned in the previous meeting. So next slide. So here's kind of a list of summarizing some of the main comments we heard from you. So these first 3 are what we've looked at so far in this analysis. So location of jobs associated with freight. So in addition to those trip ends, looking at the jobs, then how freight transportation needs vary by commodity type. And this is where we started to not only look at identifying where those activity centers are, but what are the unique characteristics, the differences between them, things like that, so that we can get at those commodities going to and from the activity centers and those unique needs that you mentioned in the previous meeting that exist depending on what types of commodities are passing through an activity center. And then national best practices, we looked at what some other MPOs around the country had done to kind of inform how we looked at these questions. So we looked at PSRC over in Seattle. We looked at the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission in Philadelphia, in that region, who does a lot of really interesting work with freight. We looked at Compass, which is the planning organization in Boise as well. So kind of looked all over to see how people are utilizing these types of data to look at freight activity centers and their transportation network. So these next three are what we haven't done yet, but now that we've started to identify activity centers and get some information on them, we want to start looking at things like multimodal availability and the connectivity and the ease of access to key transportation corridors. Some of those things that were mentioned earlier, like what is the infrastructure like, and what are the characteristics of the infrastructure and potentially the needs that leads to these activity centers. So then the last piece you mentioned, of course, the relationship to social and environmental equity, which is a requirement for us as a federally mandated MPO for the region. So start to look at some of the demographic information as well around these activity centers. So that's what we want to continue looking at in the future and hopefully present to you in the next SME meeting. Then some of the things that you pointed out, like the value and tonnage of freight, those were things that looked really interesting. But at this point, to be able to look at that at the granular level that we're evaluating here with freight activity centers, we haven't really identified a data source to be able to do that in a comprehensive way for the region. But that's part of the purpose of this study, is to identify shortcomings in our data and potential places to explore to get more data in the future, so that we can continue this process of evaluating and improving our region's freight network. So next slide. So here, just again, is that freight origins and destination density map. So use this to start to identify the freight centers, like I alluded to earlier. The next slide, we also laid on top of this our freight intensive sector employment that we showed you last meeting, but kind of looking at those two pieces of data in relation to each other spatially. How do those relate? Are there areas that maybe aren't captured by one that are captured by the other? And then lastly, we looked at the land use of the region. So this shows the land use in the comprehensive plans. The purple there is industrial, red is commercial. You've got mixed use, which has some freight uses, in orange, and blue are some of the other like institutional land uses that also have a freight component. So overlaying these three pieces of data, we started to draft some boundaries for our freight activity centers in the regions. Next slide. And here you can see kind of what the result of that was. Some pretty clear patterns emerge. You can see a lot along I-90 and 295. You can see going up US 2 and Division and 395 out in the West Plains. They tend to follow those major transportation corridors. So next slide. So here's a look at the data in a bit more detail that went into that. So you can see here, we've got on the left a chart showing the different activity centers that we identified in that last map. So 19 in total, and in blue, you can see the total freight origins and destinations from our sample data set. And on the right in the yellow, you can see the freight intensive sector employment in each of these activity centers. So some of them have a lot of both of those. Others don't have a whole lot of freight activity as far as origins and destinations go, but have a lot of that employment. So that ties really to how we and a lot of other places have classified freight intensive employment by including things like retail, food accommodation, and services. Those don't generate as many trips necessarily. They still have a freight component, but in some of our activity centers, that's what the bulk of that freight intensive employment is. So their trip rate, I guess you could say, is quite a bit lower. But just to start out, we looked at both of those and weighted them equally to see how the region, its activity center shook out doing that. So you can see that freight activity score in the table on the right. That's weighted equally, so equal weight to employment and to origins and destinations. And looking at that, you can see some clear breakpoints. So you've got the 4 really large, significant activity centers with East Spokane, of course, Spokane International Airport and West Plains and the Spokane Valley Industrial Area, as well as the Central Business District, which that's one of those examples of one that doesn't have a whole lot of freight origins and destinations, has some, but that's primarily the employment that's making it so it's weighted so highly. Then you've got the secondary and tertiary that we've identified too, which are really much more minor. Most of those are retail primarily. There's a few exceptions, but now after doing this, we looked at kind of some of the differences between those employment types. So in addition to retail, we looked at some other distinctions within that freight intensive employment sector. So next slide.
David, we have a couple of hands up.
Oh, yeah, happy to answer questions. Yeah, Inga, yeah.
I was just curious that what the boundary was for that East Spokane area really stands out. I was just curious, is that only within the Spokane city limits, or does that kind of cross over into the west part of the valley where you have that, like Fancher industrial area too?
Yeah, it does extend over outside of the Spokane city limits. So you're talking about the East Spokane one, kind of centered around Freya, but yeah, it extends out into Spokane Valley city limits as well. We use the river as the northern border for most of it, but we did this as far as where we drew up those boundaries really more intuitively than data-based. So potentially there's room for improvement, but we looked at the main features were like natural barriers like a river, also major transportation barriers like I-90, things like that, and then land use changes too, to kind of get a sense of where it seems like there was maybe a distinction between those different freight centers, and some of them border each other. So does that answer that question, Inga?
Yes, it did. Thanks.
Okay.
And then we have a question from Matt.
Okay, yeah, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. I was looking at your freight activity score with the different centers.
Hey, Matt, we can't really hear you, Matt.
I'm sorry. How's this? Is this better?
That's better. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm looking at your freight activity score. Thank you for telling me that, by the way. Your freight activity score with respect to different centers. I'm looking at this and going, okay, but you're doing this primarily based on employment in those locations, right? Or I do see you have your origins and destinations listed there also.
Yeah.
But you're not looking at tonnage though, right? I mean, for example, West Plains, you look at a Amazon facility has very low tonnage, a lot of parcel activity, versus a facility like ours that has we got 150 trucks a day, 200 trucks a month, and there's a lot of tonnage going on, which is quite a bit different. So that freight activity score, can you just elaborate on that just one more time quickly?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand how that works.
Yeah, I think you brought up a great point, which kind of highlights one of those weaknesses with our existing data is we don't, at least as far as we're aware, we don't have a good source of tonnage data that allows us to look at it at this granular level region-wide. But that's a big piece that is missing, and something that we can explore further to see if there are alternatives that we can use. I know one thing other MPOs have used to add to their activity score or freight quotient, some of them call it, is average building size or average employer size, so freight sector employer size, to try and weight some employers that might generate more freight more heavily, because it's not always directly tied, like I think you're pointing out, to the number of employees. And so as far as our current, which I would highlight is just a draft, and we're certainly open to improving it before finalizing how we're defining these activity centers, but it's just looking at employment and those origins and destinations, so trips, and it's weighting them equally. So perhaps one should be weighted more.
With employment is tough because let's take, for example, we're doing 200 rail cars a month for the BNNUP. They don't have any employees over here at our facility, and it doesn't take a lot of employees to operate, but you're running a lot of tonnage through there. Every rail car is 3 or 4 trucks, and then you've got, it's just, and then we have, like I mentioned earlier in my presentation, we got a lot of line haul carriers coming in, dropping off stuff that we have to redistribute later on. Those guys are not showing up on any employment records in this area because they're not from here. It's just kind of making you aware. There's a lot of freight going on and moving in this area, but the people aren't necessarily being paid out of this area. They might be from another area coming in, moving freight, and then leaving.
Yeah, well, and I think this is exactly the type of feedback that we're hoping to get here so that we can go back and look for ways we can adjust this formula to better reflect the actual significance to the region and things like that of these different centers, to try and identify data points that we can, or sources that we can use to capture that additional nuance. So thank you. That's really helpful. It looks like Shar is also raising her hand.
Yes, I would definitely concur with what Matt presented, and that was the gist of my question and asking him earlier about the commodity and understanding the commodity flows in and out of the region. And I think it's important to note, we always want to note where we come from and also where we're going, that this region has done, I would say, a tremendous job in preserving or attempting to preserve those primary corridors that have historically provided those significant commodity flows, not just for the region, but through the region, in which we're part of the bigger national scenario. Understanding those commodity flows is something that I think would be beneficial, and that would be the tonnage along with what type of commodity also weighs in. And in the Inland Pacific Hub study, one thing that we learned was even at the airport, when we look at the mining industry up north, while the tonnage may be minimal, the value of that commodity is very critical to what Mike pointed out earlier as far as economic vitality to our region. The airport historically has transported gold and other high value products, not necessarily having the weight, but providing the value for commodities. So I think it's a little bit more comprehensive, as Matt shared, than just employment for us as a region.
Yeah, really, really good point. And I would just reiterate that these are, I think, nuances that we want to incorporate into this analysis. So certainly hope to get feedback here on, like we're getting now, on what things to consider. And then if anyone does have feedback, I know you've been involved in a lot of the previous freight planning efforts here in the region, Shar. So sources for that type of data that would be usable here so that we can evaluate these individual freight centers in those ways as well. And perhaps one starting point would be to look at, which I'll get into in the next couple slides, but to look at those employment sectors and try and get assumptions for commodities going into these different centers. Was your hand still up, Shar?
Yeah, and I noticed that Ron Pate and Jason are on the phone, and I also think we would be remiss if we, at least on the state system, which we are very intentional about collecting data to inform our T1, our classification of freight corridors. I mean, it's not by happenstance. It's very intentional how we collect that data to be able to classify T1, T2 corridors. And I don't know, Jason and Ron, if you have anything to add that could be of help to David.
Yeah, thanks, Shar. This is Jason. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I think just to echo what's already been presented, I would concur as the freight planning manager, concur with everything that's been said in terms of what's available, sort of data limits and challenges. We at the state level also have some of those challenges as well. While we're able to get some of the freight data at a national level, and these are waybill sample data, FAF data, which stands for Freight Analysis Framework. Those are all national level freight data that get aggregated down to a state level. But beyond that, we don't have the ability to scale that down even further. So we are very limited in terms of the data. And Matt and Shar, you guys are also correct in that brings up a whole host of other questions. And I'm really glad to hear that folks are asking the right questions here in terms of what data is needed by the region, what's available, what's not. Those are the same questions that we also ask. But, in the freight world and the freight planning kind of arena, that is a pretty big gap that we all have. So I think what's already been said so far, fairly consistent with what we see at the national level. I do have to get off here pretty soon. So let me just take another 10 seconds to let folks know that similar to the federal requirement for the regional transportation plan, including a freight component to that, we are going to be updating our freight plan here, state freight plan here pretty soon as well. That is part of our federal requirement, and we're targeting that sometime in the 21 timeframe. And then for folks that don't already know, the federal government, US DOT, is supposed to come out with some news regarding a national freight strategic plan tomorrow. The details of that, I don't know. US DOT has been kind of shopping around sort of ideas, general direction for what that national freight plan looks like. And so I expect, a lot of what gets shared tomorrow, what gets rolled out will kind of trickle down to the state level. And then timely that, Spokane region is looking at updating their freight plan. That's something to think about and consider what eventually will come out of tomorrow's rollout. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Jason. That's really helpful information and definitely stuff we'll keep an eye out for. So I think based on these comments we're receiving, it sounds like Jason mentioned, it sounds like a lot of these will be limitations, but at the same time, we want to explore what options we have for maybe proxy data or something like that to make assumptions that can try and incorporate some of those missing pieces that we have when looking at freight at this granular level. So here you can see these 4 categories that we've broken up the freight intensive sector employment into. So kind of subsectors: extraction, production, distribution, and consumption. And there in the middle, you can kind of see some of those industries that are we've grouped in those categories. And we got this from this is the way the Philadelphia MPO that I alluded to, the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, has grouped their freight employment when looking at their activity centers. So this was done to give us that extra layer of information about these individual freight centers so that we can, like we've been talking about, start to maybe consider certain things more significantly, or maybe not even more significantly, but just in different ways, since as was mentioned in the previous meeting, different freight commodities and sectors have potentially different needs. So the chart on the right, you can see our regional employment. That's showing the 224,000 jobs that exist in the region. And so you can see about 42% of those are in the freight intensive sectors. A lot of those are in retail or production, or sorry, not production, but consumption. So you can see that in the light blue, and that's a big piece. And those don't necessarily generate the same types of freight volume as the others, but still do generate freight and have needs for freight connections and connections to the larger freight network. So next slide. So then we started to look at, on the individual activity center level, how the subsector breakdown played out. So this is looking at, on the chart there, you can see the percentage of employment that falls into each of these categories in the different activity centers. So you can see, like with the Spokane Valley Industrial, that particular activity center is primarily almost all consumption, or sorry, not consumption, but distribution and production, with a little bit of extraction and consumption, but it's mainly those categories. So those maybe generating those higher value or higher tonnage commodities. Those are things we want to look into to try and see how we can leverage this information to get a better sense of these activity centers and their unique needs. Then you can see on the other end of the spectrum, places like the Division Corridor in Indiana Sullivan around the Spokane Valley Mall. Those are pretty much all consumption. So we want to start looking at what are their unique needs compared to somewhere like Spokane Valley Industrial. So next slide. So here you can see just mapped out those 4 different subsectors. So extraction jobs there on the left, you can see it's a small percentage of our jobs, and those are pretty clustered in a handful of distinct areas. Then you can see production's much more prevalent region-wide, but still does follow a pretty distinct pattern that aligns pretty well with our activity centers we've identified so far. Then distribution and consumption, which is a very different spatial pattern when we look at that mapped out here compared to production. You can see that following like division and spray primarily. So on the right, that's that draft activity centers map that we've come up with, and can't see it too well on the screen here, but we will send out a PDF of this so you can take a closer look. But it shows in all caps kind of the primary commodity that exists in each of those activity centers, and then it also shows secondary commodities, which are, for the time being, we've classified them as anything that's not the most prevalent subsector, but has more than 20% of the total employment. So it's a significant piece of that activity center's employment. So that's where our analysis is at now. We want to, as I've mentioned a few times, look at some of these nuances between these different types of activity centers and what those might imply for need and significance. Then we also want to move from here to look at origins and destinations to and from these activity centers to see where trips are going, what types of freight trips they are, to leverage some additional pieces of that ATRI data. So I think we've received some really great feedback so far, and I'll hand it off. I think Kylie's going to go over a few specific questions that you've addressed in part so far, but some additional questions we have for this group that we want to get feedback on to move this analysis further. So I'll hand it over to Kylie, unless there are any other questions now that I can answer.
Thank you, David. And please feel free if you guys have questions. So we were going to break up into small groups, but I think we're going to keep it a larger group. As you can see, I'm going to put in the chat here some questions and just considerations for the group to consider when looking at these sort of 4 different maps and then the one larger map. So what we're asking of you is to help us ground truth the data. So is there anything that looks totally out of place? Do the 4 categories make sense for Spokane? And then we might be able to talk about what are the different transportation needs for each of the categories. So how do they differ from each other? So consumption is going to differ. As you mentioned, you guys, the SME team brought up that, different commodities have different needs. So if we look at the commodities in sort of 4 general categories, how do they differ from each other with regard to transportation needs? What do you like and dislike about the visuals? Is the data, how does it, just kind of give us some general, and then, any questions you might have. So I'm going to open up the floor to number 1, ground truthing the data. Is there anything that looks out of place when we're looking at sort of these heat maps here, or just comments about the data in general? I'm going to give it a second here. I'm going to finish this And if you guys want to look at the questions or considerations, go ahead, Todd.
So I guess my only comment is obviously these are as of a point in time. When we look at these, there's going to be some pretty significant changes in the near future, I think. So for instance, these don't represent changes with Amazon Fulfillment Center starting as of April 1st. We've got like North 40 under construction, which I assume will have a significant rate, maybe not, impact. A lot of construction going on along Highway 2 right now that will impact these. And so by the end of the year, this picture could look quite different.
Okay. Yeah, that is a good point. I know that, of course, when we grab data and we process data, it is a snapshot in time. And this is, I don't know if David mentioned it, it's 2019 data. It's the newest data we can grab, but I think that that's really important. What you brought up is just the changes to land uses. And so I think similar to how our other SME team, team meetings have been operating, and I know Mike can speak more to this, but we would we can bring this back to you and help. And I guess I don't know if maybe I'll defer to David how we would make those changes as far as the data goes, or show it on the maps. But yeah, great point. Thank you. And Shar, it looks like you were next.
I'm trying to see.
Getting a little bit.
Shar, we lost you. I'm not. It doesn't appear that you're on mute, but we can't hear you if you're still talking.
Yeah. We actually have.
Yeah, Shar, you're cutting in and out. Maybe if you can get your question into chat, we can try to address it that way. We're just having trouble with hearing your audio. And Kylie, real quick, I can address Todd's point while Shar's getting that question into chat. Todd, you bring up an excellent point, and I think one thing we need to sort of be committed to as a region is continuing to measure the changes that you're describing and reacting in more real time to those changes, right? We can't generate a new freight plan every 6 months, but I think there is an opportunity to continue to leverage this data into the future to start to understand those shifts that I was describing in my portion of the presentation and reacting to them in terms of investment in a more effective way, I guess. So we would expect that if we were to acquire the ATRI data for 2020 in the same period, that the shifts that you're describing, especially on the West Plains, would appear in the data. And so I would just encourage everyone to help us support this idea of continued monitoring, continually updating in more real time, or as much as practicable, this freight plan. And DOT uses a word quite often that I like quite a bit, and I think applies here, and that's this idea of a living document, right? This freight plan update is a step one and isn't the end of the road. It's the beginning of the road. So we need to be committed to continuing to leverage data to shift our forecasts, to shift our priorities, to shift our investments as our region changes. And so I think we can do that. We need to continue to acquire this data and other data sources, but I hope it's clear that this represents the beginning of the road, not the end of the road.
So Mike, this is Todd. I guess to that point, turning my statement into a question is, does it make sense to try to add these, what I would call significant events, if you will, into the model, or wait until they're reflected in the traffic counts?
Hey, Mike, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. Let me take your question in two parts. We're currently not specifically modeling freight trips within the travel demand model, and that's quite frankly, I would consider that a shortcoming of our current tool. We're working on a separate project that most of you are aware of called a data project, where we're going to be exploring some potential improvements to those tools, and that's a potential outcome of that project. But with that said, we will and we intend to incorporate some of these more recent land use into our model that's modeling vehicular trips more generally. And so there is an opportunity there to capture and especially to forecast these trips more reflective of the current land use patterns that you described in your comment now question. So the answer to that is yes, but I will be the first to admit that SRTC's toolbox in the terms of specifically freight is not complete, and we have a lot of room to improve the freight specific tools that we're applying to regional planning. So I guess the answer to your question is we address that generally speaking within the travel demand model in terms of forecasting future land uses, but we have a lot of room to grow in that regard as well.
I think one thing I would just add on to that, Mike, too, is that while like the ATRI data we may not update every 6 months or every year, potentially we do have the ability to do that with the employment data. So if we can get some sort of set of assumptions or connections that we can get between the ATRI data and employment data, that would allow us to maybe incorporate those assumptions into some estimates or assumptions that led to capturing those more recent trends on a more regular basis, even if we're not refreshing our ATRI data set that common or that frequently.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I see Shar got her question into the chat. If you are able, looks like with the 1140 timestamp, I think that might have been her question that she was trying to get across earlier. If you want to try to take that one. I can read it for the group if that's helpful. Shar's asking, how do we capture Spokane is not an island, but has historically and continues to serve as a regional hub for regional and national freight movement? With this understanding, corridors such as US 195 South should be captured as a freight activity center.
I guess in answer to that one, I ask a question, but I think my initial thought is our next step is to look at not just these centers, but also the freight corridors. And is that what, I guess what you're getting at, Shar, that something like I-95 South should be captured as a corridor, or is it, do I have an understanding of that question, I guess?
Well, I would offer that it's beyond serving as a corridor, and I think in coordinated planning efforts with the Palouse RTPO, they would most likely offer that they are a regional activity center for agriculture and other types of commodity flows. So how do you, I know it's not necessarily within Spokane County serving, with the MPO, but it's definitely, we're kind of the keeper of the junction of this commodity flow movement. So how do we continue to be good stewards of that?
Okay, that is a great point. I guess one thing we can do with the ATRI data is a second piece of the data that we haven't really dove into yet, but plan to after we look at it in Spokane County, is we did get, along with our point level data in the county's boundaries, we got aggregated ATRI data where we can capture the origins and destinations to and from Spokane at the, I believe it's the census tract level outside of Spokane, but in the Pacific Northwest, and then for the country as a whole, county. So we could start to look at those areas outside of Spokane County with that data set and identify those strong connections that maybe are outside of SRTC's planning area, but still very tied to Spokane, and maybe get a whole new set of, I guess, freight activity centers that are connections to Spokane, but outside of the region. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Us needing to capture?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
a great point. Yeah, and we do fortunately have the data with this APRI data set to start to look at those next.
Does anyone else have any questions? What do we think about the 4 categories? Does that make sense for Spokane? So we've got the extraction, production, distribution, consumption. Would you add anything? Does anything not make sense for Spokane? Would we like to continue sort of grouping these until we split them into further commodities? Would we like to refer to these 4 as sort of general groupings? Is there any any fatal flaws, if you will, with continuing in that way? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Hearing none.
Kylie, I assume that transload would fit within distribution.
That's a good question.
Transload is a distribution center.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That is correct. Yeah. Yeah. That is.
Okay. Well, that I'm gonna take that as a confirmation that this is okay, that we continue with the 4 sort of categories and refer to those as sort of, categories, and then once we look deeper at the data, we'll have more specific commodities that fit within those. Anything?
And I got a question. That consumption, that also includes healthcare, right? Because that's our biggest industry in the Spokane area is healthcare. Hospitals and things like that, and they do consume a lot of products. It doesn't state it, but I assume they're within that group, right?
Yes.
Well, actually, I believe it's not. Let me double check that, but that might be something that we should add. That's really useful to know because, yeah, I'm fairly certain that currently is not in that category with how we've classified it.
It gives it like an et cetera. So maybe we'll build out that et cetera and make sure everything in Spokane is.
Well, be careful. It's our largest industry in this
area.
If et cetera becomes more than a few percentage, you kind of got to call it out.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Okay, great point. Yeah, get that. So yeah, maybe we'll build out what exactly that means. So we've got like consumption, for example, we have like retail, accommodations, food service. So I think, for our team, maybe we'll describe those more in detail for the group. Anything that we like or dislike about the visuals? Seems pretty intuitive, like the heat map, sort of the darker or the hot spots. But how about this one larger map?
Kylie, this is Jeff. Do we have any time travel data that's fairly recent, like within the last year or 24 months even?
Do you mean like how long it takes to get from one point to the next?
Yeah. Travel times from Liberty Lake to Airway Heights or wherever, different times of the day. And I know ATRI has a lot of that data for the bigger cities. I don't know what they have for Spokane. It's never really been an issue for Spokane in the past, but I think it's coming, and I think that needs to be on our radar because like I mentioned earlier, and Matt mentioned that something we'll be discussing a lot over the next 10 years is that the bridge going over Hangman, I-90 going over Hangman there, that's already a bottleneck going east to west, and it'll continue to be that.
Well, I know that the Attree data that we received has timestamps, so I'll defer to David and he can speak more to that. But I do believe that is something.
Yeah, no, that is definitely something we can calculate from the Attree data, and so that would be for 2019. And we can break it out into any time period or look at the time, the average trip time for any specific corridor and break that out into times of day or days of the week, or months of the year, et cetera. And then the other thing that we do have access to, which is primarily limited to some of the major corridors like I-90, I think 395 and Trent might be on it, but that's the federal NPM RDS data set, which has like travel time delay and other things like that. But that's pretty limited. There's only a handful of corridors we have that for.
I think Matt would agree with me on this, and their company I'm sure be willing as well, but we'd sure be willing to participate in some kind of a freight travel time study or recording that would, our trucks we cover a big area geographically outside of Spokane, but we have a lot of trucks in Spokane every day delivering, and I know Matt does too. So I think we could get probably our best and most accurate data from ourselves, from our own group here.
It's a great point.
Jeff, can you describe, and maybe Matt can chime in here too, can you describe the technology that exists for recording that data within your own fleet? Is that something we'd have to pay to add hardware for? Does that hardware already exist and it's a matter of harvesting the data? Can you talk a little bit more about how we could potentially do that?
Yeah, we've got the data in our trucks already, and we can extrapolate manually. I'll have to give it a little more thought, and if you and I want to maybe connect up separately, I could have you even come down and look at the system we use if you're interested, or we can do it online, whatever is easiest. And yeah, the data's there. How we extrapolate it, I guess, is probably the question.
Okay, yeah, we can connect, and I'd like to involve our team here at SRTC, and we can at least start that conversation and figure out what that would take.
Sure.
I'm in alignment. I'm in accordance there as well. We capture the data. We have it. It's so it's how we convert the data over to where you can use it. You'd have to kind of get involved with us on that.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Our ELDs collect all that data. We have to monitor what state we're operating in and how many miles and that type of thing. So we have all the data that you're probably looking for.
Fantastic. Well, we have about 5 minutes left. Does anyone have any concluding thoughts or questions for the group or for us? What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to send out an email of this visual and the questions, and if you guys have anything for any other questions or thoughts you want to send us, I'm going to leave that door open. I will send you the recording, the link, and the PDF and the questions, and you guys can feel free to add your thoughts to that and just send them back to us, and we'll make sure we have that. So any other hands raised? I am going to move on. So our next save the date was sent out for September 31st. It's a couple weeks away. It's going to be sort of a continuation of this discussion. We'll have, I think we hope to have some additional visuals for you guys to react to. And, we'll be talking about sort of the regional economy, connectivity and access, commodity flows. We'll touch on that. So, and I will be reaching out to you if anybody feels inclined to share like 10 minutes, similar to how Matt and Todd Coleman and David Guthrie shared with the group. If anybody is, wanting to do that, please let me know. If not, I will reach out to you. So,
Kylie, I got a question. My calendar doesn't have a September 31st.
okay, I will double check. Maybe I haven't sent it out yet.
No, I meant I don't even have the day September 31st.
Oh,
the month of September only has 30 days.
September 30th. Yeah, is
Yeah.
it the last Wednesday? Well, guys, nobody would have come. So September 30th. Yeah, you're right. Wednesday the 30th, from 10:30 to 12.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good catch. All right, guys. Well, we will leave our doors open for you guys. If you have any more input, just let us know. Thank you for everybody's participation today and comments. I really think we got a lot of great feedback. So we're excited to take this and sort of move the needle forward. Does anybody have anything else? Sabrina, Mike, David?
No, I just want to thank everyone for their time. I know this is a significant commitment of time and will be into the future. So thanks everyone for your time and your participation. I think we're getting a better product because of it. So many thanks.
All right, guys, sign off now. We'll see you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.